Atlantic Council. It's my great pleasure to introduce the Air Combat Command Commander, General Hostage, and he is responsible for organizing, training, equipping, and maintaining combat-ready forces for rapid deployment and employment, while also ensuring strategic air defense forces ready to meet the challenges of peacetime air sovereignty and wartime defense. Now, Air Combat Command operates more than 1,000 aircraft, 22 air wings, 13 bases, and more than 300 operating locations worldwide, with 79,000 active duty and civilian workers. And additionally, when mobilized, the Air National Guard and the Air Force Reserve contribute over 700 aircraft and an additional 51,000 people to the Air Combat Command. Now, prior to his current position, General Hostage was the commander of U.S. Air Forces in the Central Command of Southwest Asia. And as the Air Component Commander for U.S. Central Command, he was responsible for developing the contingency plans and conducting air operations in a very busy 20-nation area of responsibility covering the Central and the Southwest Asia area. General Hostage is a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Fighter Weapons School, and he's a command pilot with more than 4,000 flying hours. He's flown combat missions in multiple aircraft, logging more than 600 combat hours in operations Desert Shield, Desert Storm, Southern Watch, Enduring Freedom, Iraqi Freedom, and New Dawn. And today, General Hostage has agreed to discuss the future structure, the capabilities, and the missions of the United States Air Force in this rapidly evolving strategic environment that we're all familiar with. And specifically, he's going to focus on the budget realities that we're facing today, advancing capabilities of competitor nations, and the emergence of new technologies that are going to impact the future of the United States Air Force and the mission of the Air Combat Command. He's also going to discuss how the U.S. can maintain air dominance in the face of these challenges and what opportunities exist for Air Combat Command in this changing environment. So please join me in a warm welcome for General Hostage.
Thanks, Eric. Well, thanks to all of you. Thanks to the Atlantic Council for the invitation to come up this morning, General Lake. What I'm going to do, as Eric said, I'm not going to cover all the things that were in the intro, but what I will do is, if you have a question, I will happily go down that path and talk about those those questions or those points in detail. I'll just give you a quick kind of summary of the breadth of things that are on my plate at the moment, but I'm most interested in answering your questions and kind of going down those paths that are of interest to you. So as you just heard, Air Combat Command is the provider of all the combat air forces, non-nuclear combat air forces for our Air Force and provided for the combatant commanders around the world. We are postured to organize, train, and equip all of the fighter force, the non-nuclear bomber force, the surveillance ISR force, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance forces, command and control as well, and then as well as our non-flying battlefield airmen, our tactical air controllers, battlefield weathermen, and our pararescue forces. About just under half of the Air Force from a physical size standpoint. All of Air Combat Command is postured around the continental U.S. And as I said, our principal mission is organize, train, and equip. So organize means I provide combat forces in the array of capabilities that are in our non-nuclear combat force to the missions and the tasks that all the combatant commanders around the world have need for. So any named operation, ongoing combat operations, partner training with our allied partners around the world, and then reconnaissance missions in support of combatant commander objectives. All of that is done by the ACC forces, but deployed forward and under the command and control of those combatant commanders. We train the forces. We ensure that what they have are current tactics, techniques, and procedures to meet and deal with any adversary that they might face, any of the missions that the commanders might task them for. we get a regular transmission from the combatant commanders several times a year that lays out the mission sets that they would plan on using our forces to accomplish in all phases, phases 0 up through phase 4 of combat operations. And to ensure that those tactics, techniques, and procedures that our forces are ready to use will mesh completely with the requirements of the combatant commanders. And then finally, we equip. I ensure that the tools that they have, the airmen have, are the best that we can afford to give them, and that they're sustainable over time under the pressures of combat. It's one thing to have a nice piece of equipment in the showroom. It's an entirely different thing to put it out in the field, use it at a high rate, and then have it to be sustainable and usable under combat conditions, under the austere conditions in the field that most of our forces operate in. A relatively interesting task when you look at the array of it, organize, train, and equip those forces, and challenging even with a normal fiscal process, because our fiscal process, driven on biannual budgets, leaves a fair amount to the imagination in terms of predictability and reliability with the uncertainty each year of what the budget will bring in support or non-support. Add to that the consternation of this current environment, the impact of multiple years of continuing resolutions, the draconian impact of the sequester cuts, and then on top of that, potential for non-reimbursement of an OCO bill, Overseas Contingency Operating Funds, that normally what happens is when I send forces over to the combatant commanders, I'm using my budget to pay for what they do, and then I keep tabs of that, and then I get reimbursed from the OCO funds that are released by Congress. When we came up short on the OCO refunding, then I was going to eat that out of my bill. So all three of those things kind of came at once here in March. And so it means between now and September a relatively challenging end of this fiscal year. And then resulting impacts into 14 and 15 and beyond. So a challenging set of tasks, something to keep you busy during the days and awake at night. So with that, I'd rather talk about in detail those issues or others. If you have questions, then I'm ready to answer them.
Great. Well, why don't we move on to the stage? Or
Absolutely.
You can certainly stand if you'd like to continue standing. And they pay me the big bucks to help you direct
All right.
questions to you. Thanks very much. I'm Barry Pavel, and thank you, General Hostage, again for coming up and giving us your valuable time. So I might start with a question, and then we'll
Sure.
It's moderator's prerogative, and also thanks to Saab North America for sponsoring the Commander Series. This is one of a series we have, and you've had very illustrious predecessors, but I'm sure those after you will also refer to you as in the same way. So rather than start with sequestration, which is I'm sure you get all the time, and I'm sure you're dealing with all the time, we spend a lot of time here looking to the longer term, to the future. We supported the National Intelligence Council on their Global Trends 2030. Report, which talked about a world where a range of new technologies will be changing certainly the military operating environment, but also sort of our general operating environment. That includes robotics. It includes, unmanned things like additive manufacturing or 3D printing, as it's known. And so I don't know how much, I assume, sort of in light of your force provider and other responsibilities, that you're sort of also weighing in on the long term. And so would love to hear you talk about sort of the 2020, 2025 time frame, and how are you sort of shaping, the Air Force that General Welsh will leave to his successors?
The challenge for us is I have an immediate in-your-face task of providing ready, trained, and equipped forces. And at the same time, I've got grandkids. I want them to live in the same wonderful society that I got to grow up in. And so I want to posture and ensure that the Air Force that protects them is as capable against the array of challenges it might face in their time frame. And then when you add the consternation of the fiscal challenges, there's a trade-off that has to be made. So we're daily looking at the assessment of our current readiness, the modernization of the force as we move through time, and then how big that force is. It's kind of it's like a water balloon. You squish it in one place, it gets bigger in another, and vice versa. It is, for us, it's not a zero-sum game, it's a reducing sum game, because they keep lopping amounts off. So within the context of all that, there's a temptation to say, well, I'll just stop buying new stuff, put all my money into current forces, so I'll be ready for tomorrow's battle. And that works really well for a while until things wear out. We are unfortunately in a period of time when the bulk of the combat air forces is relatively ancient. I use the term ancient because a fighter is normally built for 8,000 hours worth of life. You look at any of the equipment that the Air Force operates, we operate it well in excess of what the manufacturer's original intent was. And with full concurrence with the manufacturer as we refit, rebuild, refurbish, and replenish the capabilities, both from a wear standpoint as well as a capability standpoint, because you have to increase the capabilities as your adversaries increase their capabilities. The challenge for us now is how to recapitalize that old force to the future. So the normal mode of recapitalizing within the military, because every time you purchase something new, it's an element of risk, because until you actually use it in combat, you don't know if it's actually going to be, meet the test. And so the conservative, when fiscal pressure isn't the driver, the conservative path is to take relatively measured steps and just iterate your way to advanced capability. That's an expensive way to do business. So when I've been talking to my industry partners here of late, what I'm telling them is you can expect we're going to take longer leaps in technological advancement and fewer leaps. That's going to mean we're going to need to make more accurate leaps when we do, because the normal mode in the military was, well, if I want to produce a capability, let me look at 2, 3, 4 solutions to that capability, try them out, test them rigorously, figure out which is the best, then invest in that path and move down the way. Made for a strong industrial base because you had numerous competitors out there vying for the program, and then some chance of winning the contract. I can't afford to buy multiple solutions, use them for a while, and then go down a path. I'm going to have to be more accurate and more precise in picking the path and then going down that path. So what I've talked to industry about is need to have a tighter partnership so that they understand what our requirements are in as much detail as we can give them. That they continue to spend the IR&D, it's I forget what the acronym's for, but it's basically their version of research and development. They look at evolving trends and capabilities in the technical world. They take them from the whimsical to the science. The science community has these neat concepts. They bring them the next step forward to an actual engineering solution that not necessarily fully produced in volume, but they actually produce real capability, and then try to match that to problem sets that we lay out for them. For them to spread their IR&D budget across a wide expanse, hoping to find those few solutions that make sense to us, might have worked in a less fiscally constrained environment, but pretty risky in the future we face. So I want to help them narrow that IR&D focus down to those areas where we know we're going to have those capabilities. We believe the science and technology that will support those capabilities for the future has enough probability of success that that's the place to go, and then they start bridging between the science and technical world to the possible, the art of the practical possible. Then we look at those capabilities, pick the path, and move. We just had before the big crunch hit, I held an innovation conference at Air Combat Command. We asked academics from a range of interesting fields to come in and meet with our air staff, our ACC staff, as well as with our industry partners. And we had the science, the academics talk to us about different ways in how a biological system thinks of defense, how a societal system, societies through history have thought about defense. Then we laid out our problem set from an ACC futures perspective. What are the problems we think we're going to have to be able to solve? And then just kind of engaged in a dialogue on how to draw parallels from different realms of science, realms that we would not ordinarily have thought about. So we're still thinking about that future, but we're going to have to be more focused and more judicious about where we spend the money, just because there isn't going to be that much resource to spend it. Because at the same time, there are combatant commanders out there with real-world problems every day that I've got to provide forces for.
Yeah, right now. So just one follow-up. I mean, what if you were projecting the Air Force 10 years from now, I would imagine sort of a different mix of unmanned versus more conventional manned systems?
Well, there's always the lure of technology. There's this perception that, well, unmanned must be better because it's new technology, it's different, so it must be better. Unmanned brings some unique capabilities. The principle amongst them is persistence. You put an RP or an unmanned vehicle over an area, and it doesn't complain about being tired. It doesn't whine about having to go to the bathroom. You can keep it out there for the full length of its mission. The crews on the ground who are operating it, I can cycle them out without affecting the mission. But there are limits on its awareness of what's going on around it. There are limits on the acuity and the array of sensors and things that they're able to do. So they do have finite limits. The challenge for us is how to leverage their strengths and minimize those weaknesses. We believe unmanned flight is here to stay, and it's going to have a growing portion of what we do. But it isn't the panacea that I think some would expect. You go to an airport today, and you check in your bags. You'll get on a tram and go out to the terminal where the airplanes are. You won't think twice about getting on that tram that has no driver and just shuttles you out to the building. So as a society, we're okay with unmanned things. But I guarantee you there's not anybody in this room who would get on the airliner and look to the left and see just blinking lights and happily go back down and sit in aisle 12C and fly away with HAL flying you to the next destination. Technologically, we could do that today. I mean, I do that with my large wing UAVs all the time. I fly them halfway around the world and land them in odd places. It's technologically doable, but societally, we haven't gotten there. Psychologically, we haven't gotten there yet. Think about putting a nuclear-armed UAV out there. We're not ready to do that yet. Think about, we have the technology to tell a UAV to go out in an area and autonomously accomplish a mission. But societally, morally, we're not ready yet to just send machines out to do something that doesn't have a human in the loop making the critical decisions. So we have to marry our societal requirements and our psychological requirements with the technical requirements as we move forward. So all that's to say that the UAV is not the answer to all problems. It is the answer to many problems, and we're pursuing them vigorously, but probably not as vigorously as the uninformed would have us do.
Great. Well, thanks very much. And I would just add that with the advent of driverless cars, I think that psychological preparation is advancing very rapidly. I was in Silicon Valley 2 weeks ago, and one of the comments I heard from a father that was expecting his first child was, "My child will never have to learn how to drive a car." Mm-hmm. Very interesting. So now we'll turn to questions. I have one already from Steve Grundman in the second row, and then I'll take certainly others as well.
Thanks, Barry. I'm Steve Grundman. I'm the Lund Fellow here at the Atlanta Council, and I want to go from the esoteric future to the very immediate present. And I can't think of someone more at what I'll call the pointy end of sequestration than you and Air Combat Command. And I'd like to give you an opportunity to address the sort of the storyline that is emerging a month into sequestration that not so bad. When I read what choices you are making, and then I'm not sure if everyone picked up what you said, is not only is there sequestration, but you're now actually trading off money to pay for OCO, which in principle was fenced from this fiscal turmoil. I would appreciate you talking about that, because I think it's a story that's getting overwhelmed by the nonchalance of the fact that the sky didn't fall on 1st of March.
Well, unfortunately, the degradation is not something immediately visible. On the 8th, I grounded, or ground is the wrong term, I put into a low state of readiness 9 fighter squadrons and 3 bomber units. Now, the bomber squadrons themselves will be staged internally. Some crews will be trained, some won't, because they have a nuclear mission in some of the bomber force in addition to their non-nuclear missions. So different methodology, but the net effect was 12 units were put into that low state of readiness starting on the 8th. On the 9th, they're still ready to go to war with full capability. There'd be no difference. A month from now, there'd be some degradation, but they could still go. 2 months from now, not so fast, because we start losing landing currency, we start losing proficiency to safely operate the equipment, either tactically or just from a pilot sense. So the degradation isn't instantaneous when we institute these problems, at least for the flying piece. That's the part that got all the press. What's killing me at the moment is I'm starting to look at closing ranges. I shut down my weapons school, so that doesn't have an immediate effect, because I'm going to truncate the current class and graduate them without the final graduation exercise. But I canceled the next class. That's going to affect the Air Force for the next 20 years. I can't get that class back. I'm going to have to close ranges. Now, I'm going to keep the big ranges, the Nellis Range and the Utah Test and Training Range, open for a while. But I have to close the small ranges around the country that support my different bases. So the skills at dropping weapons accurately and such will start to atrophy, because I won't have the ground ranges to use anymore. I'll have the airspace above them, because I don't really do anything to maintain the airspace, but the ground ranges all get shut down. And when the people who maintain those ranges, they're contractors. I don't use Blue Suit because Blue Suit's too expensive to use. I use a contractor to do it. When that contract goes away, those people go find jobs elsewhere. So it'll take me a year or two to get them back and reconstitute that range. So that is an instantaneous loss. Once I close that range and shut it down, I'm probably looking at 2 years to restart a range. So the impacts are not immediate, but the recovery from them is going to be long term. I've driven my combat air forces into what's called tiered readiness. Normal methodology for our air forces is, if I send forces forward and they operate in an operational theater and they come back, they regenerate very quickly within a matter of a week or two. A carrier comes back from deployment, they will go into a low state of readiness, the air wing will go somewhere else, the ship's company will disperse to a degree, the ship goes through significant maintenance for an extended period of time, then they rebuild the force to send a carrier battle group back out. I don't do that with an air base or with an Air Force wing, because when something happens somewhere in the world, the first call is start flowing forces. Well, what flows is air forces. We build a tanker bridge, and within 72 hours we're flowing forces, air forces, material to support air forces, material to start supporting the forward elements of our joint partners. That air bridge is threatened by sequester. The mobility force that would haul that forward presence is threatened by, is impacted by the sequester. And then the forces I would send obviously won't be, it'll take me 60 to 90 days to regenerate a force that's been thrown into that dormant status for a 2-month period. It'll take me 60 to 90 days to get them ready to go anywhere. So you got to hope your adversary will give you that 60 or 90 days leeway. That for me is the immediate challenge. And the temptation is to say, well, I'll stop spending money on investing in new stuff and keep the airplanes flying now. Well, these airplanes won't last forever. We've ridden them hard for the past 20 years in the conflicts through the Middle East and such. And we have to replenish and regenerate that force. So it's a balance. And the balance right now is very difficult to make with the current size force that I have. I'm challenged. I mean, ideally, I'd like to close every third base that I own. I mean, I wouldn't like to do it, but I have no choice. We have dropped our size of our force by 500 aircraft, yet we've hardly closed an installation. And so I'm woefully under using the infrastructure that I have. If the nation's going to spend this much on defense, we ought to size our force to fit within that TOA. The challenge for us right now is I'm bigger than the amount of total operating authority I'm being given, but I'm not allowed to reduce the force. I'm not allowed to reduce infrastructure. So I have to spread too little money across that larger force, and I have to sub-optimize something.
Thank you. It's a very important answer, I think, especially the accumulating problems that each sort of passing week and each passing month brings, that I think is underappreciated, and also the important point about bases, and the President submitted the FY14 budget, which I think called for another BRAC round, which I think is sorely needed. We had a question from Arnaud de Bourgegrave in the front.
General, can I infer from what you said that you do not see unmanned air-to-air combat in our future?
Oh,
And
I
also,
didn't say
could you-
that.
No,
No, absolutely I do.
you do.
But
Could
I
you
don't
talk a
see
little
it
bit
tomorrow.
about the F-22 as well?
Pardon
Could
me?
you talk about the F-22 a little bit?
Absolutely. Yeah, well, let me finish the thought of the unmanned combat vehicles. Yeah, and you're talking specifically combat against another air platform. Well, we fired an air-to-air missile off a Predator 20 years ago, or actually maybe 18 years ago in desert. Well, that was an unmanned, and I was shooting at a manned Iraqi airplane at the time, but absolutely, I see that coming someday. But we're not there technologically yet, and I can't just rush the technology to just put something out there that has that capability when I have manned airplanes that are better at it than the current technology lets me get there. We are pursuing, and as you know, I talked to Barry about that innovation. We're looking at what technology is coming when we think that capability would be here, then factoring into our replenishment and our replacement path when we think we'd make that transition. You know, we're in the midst of trying to bring the F-35 into the inventory. I'm already looking at its replacement. They'll long after I'm in the rocking chair on the front porch, but I have to set that path in motion because of the acquisition lead times for getting new technology into the field in volume. So what that next generation will look like, we're looking at the range of possibilities. What we think the technology will provide us in that, and then what the adversary's capabilities. What do we have to have in order to be successful? And if an unmanned air-to-air combat vehicle is the right answer, then we'll most certainly go down that path. In terms of the F-22, you may have seen the most recent press release. We have the F-22s in Alaska are flying the long-range missions out to defend the borders of the ADIZ as the Russians come doing their trips around in the very cold parts of the world. The F-22, I had the opportunity to fly it for a couple of months, and I got to tell you, it's everything anybody ever told me about. It is truly a magnificent capability. It does all the things that I was told it could do, and as effectively as I could have hoped for. The challenge for me at the time was I had a force whose confidence had been undermined by a stand down, by some anomalies that we couldn't explain, and then the linkage, not necessarily accurately, the linkage of those anomalies to an accident that we'd had. And thus, but the opportunity to go fly the airplane to help understand what the challenges are, to try and reinstill confidence in the platform, has given me a tremendous appreciation for what that fifth generation capability provides us. Because as we move into the next decade, into the 20s, our expectation is that the adversary's capability will grow to a point where you'll need a certain amount of fifth generation just to be able to enter the battle space. Now in the early 20s, right now I've got a force that can probably deal with that. As we get into the 20s and move beyond, I'm going to need more and more of that fifth generation because the threat array becomes impregnable to a fourth generation capability. The F-22 provides a very unique fifth generation because it combines the stealth of fifth generation with an altitude and a speed that really renders it the opportunity to go wherever it needs to go, pretty much not necessarily unchecked, but certainly it has a range of options that no fourth generation has. Even the F-35 won't have, because the combination of altitude, speed, and stealth, it gives it that remarkable capability. But I have a tiny little fleet. 187 is just not big enough to do all the things I'm going to have to do as I get deeper into the next decade. And that's where the F-35 is going to start bringing more of that fifth generation, because I will still have a significant volume of fourth generation aircraft that in order to meet the requirements of the different war plans that we study, I have to have volume. Volume counts. When you have an adversary that has tremendous volume, you can have a highly capable force, but it's still got to be big enough that numbers match. And so I will have to have a certain amount of fourth generation that will go to the end of the next decade. But that fourth generation without fifth is unsurvivable. It really has no relevance. And the ratio of fifth to fourth will change. The requirement of that ratio will change as we get deeper into the next decade. So the F-22 is the linchpin right now of my fifth generation fleet. And as I build, and their adversary builds a capability that requires more of it, the F-35 will become a critical element to that 5th gen fleet.
Thanks very much. We had a question from Sandra Irwin in the second row over here.
Thank you very much. General, following up on the comments you just made on F-35 and F-22, a lot of the studies that we read about the future of the Air Force, they talk about the access problem, the runways. You're not going to have runways everywhere you go. So here we are with the Air Force investing most of its dollars in short-range fighters. So what thoughts and concerns do you have on that issue, and is the Air Force really preparing for that future when you
Absolutely.
will not have access?
Every aircraft I have is air refuelable. So everybody's happily points out what they call short range. The F-35's range is better than any current fighter I have, its operating range. And I can force extend that with tankers to a significant distance. So I don't buy into the idea that short range fighters have no applicability. Access is always an issue because I operate off of land bases. The national strategy with the pivot to the Pacific, which is a rebalancing of where our focus of effort, because our focus of effort has been, for the past 2 decades has been in the CENTCOM arena, in stability and peace in the Middle East. And that has required a certain type of capability. The capability requirement has changed. When Saddam had his force, we had a certain requirement. When we went into Afghanistan, it required a different level of capability. And then subsequent, the counterinsurgent warfare that drove a very high density of ISR support and close air support drove a different set of requirements. So every arena has a unique set of capabilities. As we start to look at what it would take to be counted and to be credible against a near-peer competitor, someone who has a level of capability that approaches or potentially someday could exceed ours, that requires a different kind of capability. That's what the 5th generation discussion is about. As I try to push that out into the Pacific, the intent is of this national strategy is to say, we have friends and allies. We're a Pacific nation. We have many friends and allies in the Pacific. And quite honestly, the energy of the world over the next century will be focused on what's going on in the Pacific, because that's, the size of the populations out there, the resource requirements for those populations, the economy those populations will generate. I mean, that's where the energy of the planet's going to be looking. And so the idea is that we've got many friends and allies out there who, without somebody with our capability, are going to be challenged to maintain their own way. And so our pivot is to say, hey, we're present, we're credible, we're capable. All we want is peace and stability and free trade amongst the different partners in the Pacific. That's our intent with this strategy. That requires that we be present and capable. With those friends and allies, that gives us our access. If there's challenge, we'll partner with our coalitions, build coalitions to deal with problems. That gives us the access to the arena. I can then, with my force extensible capability, put forces where they need to be and keep them there. Long answer to say they're short ranged without refueling support, but I have that capability.
A question in the far back.
Hi, sir. Sequestration will pass, and we'll get back to operations at some level. It seems to me that the training aspect of 4th and 5th generation is going to be critical for the A2AD. Mm-hmm. Can you comment a little bit on what live virtual constructive plans Air Combat Command has for the 5th generation and 4th generation? I mean, 16s, 15s are still going to be there, but making them work together and be able to work in the A2AD environment?
Absolutely. Let me just make one comment about your opening premise. Sequestration will go away, but not for a very long time, unless there's a deal cut that changes the rules, because it's a 10-year impact, and I'm facing that impact over the next decade. So unless something changes, and right now I don't see it changing, I'm trying to build a path to the future that deals with that impact. So LVC, Live Virtual Constructive. And I just mentioned that I canceled Red Flag. Or maybe I didn't mention. I said I terminated the next weapons school class, but I also canceled the next Red Flag, which is kind of the crown jewel of training of our combat forces for a vast array of types of conflict. This refocus of the national strategy is to build capabilities to deal with the anti-access to challenged environments, contested, denied operations. We have been building out in Red Flag. The most recent Red Flag combined space, cyber, and combative non-nuclear combat forces into a very dense and challenging array of capability, both from a threat standpoint as well as our capability to deal with that threat. That kind of training done in the open with the missions and emanations that come with that provide a lot of notice to folks who are paying attention as to what our capabilities are, what we're thinking about what our adversary could do, what we're thinking about we ought to do to deal with those adversaries. One of the neat things about our 5th generation capability is you can't see a lot of what it can do. I mean, you asked the question about the F-22. I didn't understand it till I got in the airplane and actually went and flew it. I'd been told what it could do. I read about what it could do. Based on my experiences of flying 4th generation for many, many years, I said, yeah, okay, yeah, maybe it could do that. Holy Christmas. You should see what it can do. It is really stunning. That, I can't show you a lot of what it can do, and that's going to be more and more the case as we move to a larger 5th generation force. A lot of the capabilities I don't want to advertise. And so I'm not going to be able to take it out on a range like Nellis and use it to its full level of capability. First, because they're terribly disruptive when they do the things that they have to do and destructive, so I can't do that. And then I don't want to give it away. So I think what's going to happen, we're going to invert the paradigm. Today I use live virtual constructive at the level of technological capability that we've been able to buy, not what the technology is able to produce, but what we've been able to buy thus far to do the more rudimentary things. We do instruments, we do emergency procedures, we do part task training, we do mission type training, but that at a less than the full up level. We're kind of pushing the levels of, the technology that we've been able to afford to buy. As we move into more and more 5th generation, we're going to need to invest, and we have been, in distributed mission architecture that allows us to link simulators across the country into a virtual environment where we can use the full capabilities of the systems and have lethal real-time kill removal, so that when you fight 2 airplanes in real life, one stimulates shooting a missile that says, I shot you, and it's like when your little kid's going, I shot you, no, I shot you, and you argue about who got shot first. Meanwhile, the dynamics of the fight are changed irreversibly. In a simulated world, when you shoot a missile, if your missile worked, his didn't, he goes away, and you move on. That changes radically how you fly your mission when he actually goes away. That's one of the limitations of training in the real world. So the LVC world offers, to some degree, higher level of fidelity of training when you can get enough players in there and get the technological aspects solved. That's the path we're headed to with LVC. We will do our high-end mission training in the virtual world, and we'll do the part task training, the mission training, we'll do the more mundane training in the real airplanes. So you still have to fly the real machines so that the aviators and the operators are fully apprised of how the real world, because the simulated world is never 100% fidelity. So you still have to operate the machines, but the LVC world will be where we do the high-end training, the full-up training. I would anticipate someday our red flag will be a virtual red flag. That's where the high-end stuff will be done. Then we'll do some of the other mission sets that we can safely do from a security standpoint in the real world. But that distributed mission architecture is critical. And then, so if you look at if I just took a briefing yesterday and all the things I'm not going to be able to fund that I'm going to have to stop this month, DMO, some of the DMO architecture's on there. Now I'm trying to preserve the DMO at the local level so that the aircrew that can't fly their airplanes can at least fly their simulators. But I can't even afford to fund the linkage that connects them together to other bases. So I'm just the level of pain in dealing with this sequester really is significant. And unfortunately, it's not visible. And it's hard to make it understandable to someone who doesn't live in the world that I live in of trying to produce operational capability.
Unfortunate. It's a gentleman in the middle that's been very patient right there, yeah.
I think that took in about 12 people, Barry.
I'm Jeffrey Lynn from Senator Angus King's office, and I was wondering, Could you talk a bit about cost escalations for F-35 since it's gone over budget a bit since the 2000, and also how that would affect programs like the long-range strike bomber, as much as you could speak about it, obviously.
Certainly.
Its role in anti-access operations.
I'm not a financial expert, so I will not begin to try to walk you through the nuances of cost escalation, things like that. One of the big challenges we face is the concurrency issue. I'm sure that's a familiar term to most folks. There was a decision, a strategic decision made a decade or more ago that when we brought this new airplane in, because at the time there was a belief that computers would be able to tell us to a very high level of fidelity whether our design was good, that we would not need to do the series of testing that we would normally have done before we started producing airplanes. So they started down the path of designing, building, started producing, and then started testing in parallel. Finding out that, well, the simulation wasn't quite as accurate as we thought. We have to go back and fix a few things. Well, it's very disruptive to an assembly line to go in the middle of the assembly line, stop it, change everything, try to fix. It's actually cheaper to let the airplane finish, then put it into another line that will do the mods to it. That's what concurrency is. We have actually driven down the majority of the concurrency issues at this point. At this point, our testing is finding small things that can be waited on until the airplanes are fielded. The big concurrency items are, I knock on wood, I believe are behind us. But that has driven an escalation in cost because nobody planned on having to go do that rework. Every time someone tries to solve a budget problem by cutting a few airplanes off the buy, the price goes up. So I have a harder time explaining why I'm trying to buy 1,763 of them. Every time you cut one off the numbers, the price goes up. Then you ask me, how come you're spending too much? Well, you keep cutting the numbers back. So, and then every time it gets stretched out because somebody has a new good idea, that costs more. So again, the practical impacts are the ones I focus on. I'm not the numbers guy to explain the details. But concurrency is the big one that I think that's been the headline.
We're almost running out of time. We'll take a couple more. Right here, third row.
General Mark Shantz, Air Force Magazine. I want to ask you about what is arguably your core mission at Air Combat Command, something we haven't really mentioned yet, and that is air dominance. It's a mission that hasn't really been talked a lot about in the last decade or so because it's just kind of been there. You know, one Army general said, I don't know how it happens, but it's there, and I need it to do everything that I do. You mentioned the Innovation Summit a little while ago, and I want to ask you, at ACC, how are you thinking about air dominance? What is it? What do you tell people what it is? And what is it going to look like in 10 years? Because this is a conversation that usually winds up getting bogged down talking about force structure and, capabilities. But, I want to ask you about the bigger picture.
Sure.
What does that mission mean?
Well, fundamentally, air dominance is the ability to operate within a domain, either, if not unchallenged, at least not being prohibited from operating. You can talk about air superiority, air supremacy, air dominance. They're kind of ranges of that ability to operate in a space, a domain. As you rightly point out, we have not faced a challenge to air supremacy, air dominance for a long time. We talk about it was back in the 50s in Korea when the last American died on the ground due to an enemy air attack. So there's been an assumption over time that, well, we will always operate in an area where the noise overhead is friendly. That won't necessarily always be the case. Now, for the past 2 decades in the Middle East, it's pretty much been the case. Now, the adversaries we faced that at times had some air capability, we were able to dominate them relatively quickly. If we were to have to deal with challenged, denied space or the anti-access area denial challenges of a near-peer competitor, not necessarily the case. So air dominance in an A2AD environment, in a contested denied environment, will be more temporal. It won't be pervasive. I won't be able to operate 24/7 over a piece of airspace with no worry about who else is out there other than controlling traffic so that we don't run into each other because it's lots of friendlies. But I will still be able to operate. The neat thing about air power, one of the attributes of air power that makes it so effective is its flexibility and its agility. So I will be able to concentrate air where it's needed for the period that it's needed and provide the dominance in that area. And then as the threat responds and deals with it and the problem and the need for it moves to somewhere else, I can move that air power. That's one of the great capabilities that air power brings to the battle space. I won't be able to take this current fleet of ISR airplanes I have, Predators and Reapers, and park them over an adversary and stare at them for days and weeks at a time. They'll have something to say about it. But I will produce assets that can deal with that denied airspace and provide awareness of what that adversary is doing. May not be continuous, but I'll be able to provide it at a level that allows our combatant commanders to do what they have to do. The nature of the contested environment is that someone's going to challenge you for that space. So air dominance means when you're there, you have to be able to hold the upper hand. And we're working the fleet. We're working the TTPs. I'm changing the culture of Air Combat Command at the moment. Now, I got to tell you, my predecessor, General Fraser, started this. And General Rue's been the engine behind it. But fundamentally, we are changing the culture to where every day our crews go out and train, at least up until I told them they couldn't fly anymore. They were training for an environment that was contested or degraded. We have developed a tremendous ability with our data links, with our communications, with our radars, with a variety of sensors that operate and dominate the space. Our adversaries have watched this and are investing heavily in capabilities to deny us those tools to try to limit our ability to operate. And when I grew up, because the systems were still relatively new, when General Leo and I were out there flying airplanes, the radars were not necessarily 100% all the time, and the comms were a little spotty, and somebody could just key a microphone and jam your comms, so you had to have tactics and techniques and procedures for dealing with degraded radars, degraded communications. There was no such thing as data links. Our kids today, our systems are so reliable that they turn the system on, the radar always works, the communications always work, the data link is solid. I'm taking it away from them. Every day they go out, they're going to lose something. You know, they'll fly one scenario where the GPS isn't working. They'll fly another scenario where their comms aren't working, or number 3's IFF's not working. And so what I want them to be able to do is operate routinely and effectively in a contested, degraded environment. Because when my adversary looks out there and said, I've just spent buckets of money on this and they're still fighting, they're still able to operate, it changes the calculus. That's what this is about, changing the calculus. We will be able to operate in that contested, degraded environment. Not at 100% like I could do when, I've been doing for 20 years in the Middle East, but I will still be lethal and effective, and that will change the adversary's calculus of what he's able to do.
Because we began a little late, I'm going to make sure you get your money's worth and get
I'm in no hurry.
Two more questions. I think I'll take them both at the same time, and then we'll get a final set of answers and remarks from General Hostage. So the two gentlemen that have their hand up, and if you could identify yourselves, that'd be great.
Hello, I'm Ahmed, a judge from Egypt. In the light of your answers, I want to consider the recent reduction in the number of the U.S. Aircraft carriers, while at the same time China is deploying its first carrier. Is this a sign that there is a shift to more non-conventional weapons, or is it an adaptation to the limits on the budget, or is it a combination of both factors? Thank you.
Well, I'm not really qualified to speak to changes in our naval force posture. Quite honestly, I don't believe we'd taken down a carrier.
I think the reference was to the
Stennis turning around. Maybe.
The Navy was going to deploy, was it the Truman to the Gulf, and because of sequestration they said not going to deploy.
If that's what you're talking about, the carrier that came back to port, that was most definitely, that's equivalent to my grounding to stopping flying my airplanes. It was an immediate issue of the sequester impacts. Both I and my naval counterparts are looking at what does a near-peer competitor environment look like? How do I deal with the anti-access to degraded environment? I work very closely with Admiral Gortney, my counterpart in the Navy at Fleet Forces Command. Our forces train every day in working you've heard the term air-sea battle. We work every day in how to meld the air forces and the naval forces to a seamless operation in what is a challenged environment, a broad expanse of sea space and airspace that is contested. To your question, the immediate impact of the carrier was a sequester impact, but it doesn't represent any change in our view that it takes a combination of air and sea power to be effective in this new theater.
And then we had one more question here, and then we can wrap up.
Hi, Shen Shoji from NHK Japanese TV. You had to assign B-52s, B-2s, and F-22 to the Fall Eagle in South Korea. And how is the combination of the uncertain Korean Peninsula plus the sequestration complicates your ability to meet the resource needs of Pacific Command today?
Mm-hmm. Well, my fundamental driving requirement is to ensure that the combatant commanders who have immediate operational requirements, named operations, combat operations, have the forces they need. And I'm husbanding the resources I do have to ensure that. So we have deployed bomber forces, continuous bomber presence in the Pacific. We've got deployed fighter forces augmenting the forces that already live out in the Pacific theater, in order to ensure that they have the flying hours and the operating funds that they need to operate. I've had to take squadrons down here in the United States. What that means is if there's an immediate call for augmentation, tomorrow I can do it. Next month, maybe not. And it will take me a period of time to generate forces back up to a point where I can support them. Or our national leadership will have to decide where I pull resources from some other combatant commander that has them, and I shift them to that theater. So as time goes on, the challenges will increase if we persist in this path. One comment I'll make about this tiered readiness is it presents a significant challenge for the future, because to climb back out of tiered readiness requires an increase in resources above your steady state operating levels, because when you drive a unit down to a low state of readiness, getting them back up to normal is not just a matter of putting them back to a normal budget. You have to add resources above that to get them back up to a normal level. Mm-hmm. So it's getting down into this hole it's the slippery slope. I can get down there pretty easy, but climbing out of it's going to be a real challenge.
Well, thanks, General Hostage. I know you've really given me a much more granular sense of the impact of sequestration, and it makes me want to run over to Capitol Hill right now and force the issue. But really, greatly appreciate your insights. Thanks for coming here, and also thanks to Alex, Brittany, and Ms. Oy, who helped put this event together, and look forward to seeing you again at some point. Thanks very much.
Speak one note of optimism here. We have the most amazing young men and women out there producing air power. They are incredible. They are as good as any generation that we've ever fielded. They are tremendously skilled at what they do. They've been involved in combat operations now for a long time, so they're really very hardened in the terms of the type of air power that we produce. We're in the midst of rebalancing their set of capabilities to deal with that broad array of challenges out there, and I have every confidence that they will do an amazing job. My challenge is to try to give them the resources and not ask more of them than the nation's willing to resource. And that'll be the immediate challenge, because if I do that, the most tragic outcome of this will be a loss of confidence and and impacts to the morale of that force. They are the national treasure. So those are the ones that's of all the people we need to solve this problem for, those young men and women that we ask to go put their lives at risk. That's why we need to go solve this problem, to give them what they need. So thank you all very much for your interest.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Great, thank you.